Before running off to bed, I think I ought to try and produce as comprehensive an overview of the precarious position that Kyiv finds itself in, caught in the crosshairs of Russian aggression and a shifting um, transactional US approach, and also the complexity of negotiating the United Nations. Kyiv's position on the international stage uh, has rested for the last 3 years on the principles of its sovereignty and the collective backing of Western allies. And the UN has been a forum where Ukraine's territorial integrity was staunchly defended. But with Trump's arrival, with Trump's um, appearance, all that has changed. And a United Nations Security Council resolution calling for a swift end to the war in Ukraine was passed with an unusual coalition, while Moscow and Beijing voted in favour. Key Western states, France and the UK, abstained. This outcome is emblematic of a deep fracture in the transatlantic alliance. Of course, peace is something to be desired and to be sought at all costs, really. But peace that grants approval in some form to the aggressor is unacceptable. And peace that will not last is unacceptable. A peace that effectively is predicated on another version of the Minsk agreement is unacceptable. And the resolution's lack of explicit language condemning Russian aggression or affirming Ukraine's territorial integrity underscores this strange diplomatic shift, a move away from clear-cut positions to a more ambiguous transactional approach. And in this new paradigm, even traditional allies are showing signs of reluctance to offer Ukraine unequivocal support, leaving Kyiv exposed in a forum it once relied upon for moral and political legitimacy. Simultaneously, Ukraine has entered into sensitive negotiations over this mineral deal with the United States, a deal that represents both opportunity and risk. And Ukrainian officials have characterized this framework agreement as a stepping stone towards broadening their relationship with Washington, with hopes it might eventually translate into a long-term security commitment. And the arrangement, which involves the joint development of Ukraine's mineral resources, including gas, oil, rare earth elements, was touted as an economic lifeline in the middle of this protracted conflict. But the deal comes with significant caveats. Notably, while the final version of the agreement removes previously onerous terms, such as the demand for a US stake potentially worth $500 billion, it omits explicit security guarantees. In effect, President Zelenskyy has to accept a deal that promises economic cooperation but leaves Ukraine's strategic defense in a state of uncertainty. And by caving into this proposal, Ukraine is risking a future in which its natural resources are leveraged as bargain chips while its sovereignty remains under threat. It's a classic case of a nation forced to choose between immediate economic relief and the long-term imperative of security. And on one side of this delicate balance stands Russia, a state that's persistently attempted to undermine Ukraine's independence with military might and strategic diplomacy. And Russia's endorsement of the UN resolution, which fails to label its own aggression explicitly, is a stark reminder of Moscow's willingness to blur the lines between diplomacy and subversion. And every concession made by Kyiv, including the minerals deal, risks emboldening Russian ambitions and Russian trolling and Russian propaganda. Any perceived weakening of Ukraine's resolve or sovereignty could, in Moscow's eyes, be exploited to further destabilize the region. On the other side is the United States, and traditionally a steadfast ally. Recent actions, most notably under the last few weeks of the Trump administration, signal a shift towards a more transactional, interest-driven foreign policy, and the US has moved from a model of collective Western defense to one that emphasizes bilateral negotiations, even engaging directly with Moscow on issues that had once been the exclusive domain of coordinated Western policy. And by entering into a deal that appears to prioritize economic considerations over clear security commitments and clear moral positions, Kyiv risks being caught in the crossfire of American strategic recalibration. And this transactional approach may provide short-term gains, but it leaves open the possibility that when the strategic interests shift, Ukraine's security guarantees could be rendered insignificant. And the ambiguity at the UN and the concessions in the minerals deal are not isolated phenomena. They're indicative of a broader reordering of international alliances, and European powers, long the bedrock of Ukraine's support, are themselves recalibrating their positions, are having to rethink what do they believe, actually. And the abstentions by France, by the UK, and others on key resolutions illustrate a growing reluctance to fully commit as European capitals now weigh their own strategic interests and the costs of antagonizing both Russia on the one hand and a fractured US policy, foreign policy on the other hand. And the hesitancy is mirrored in other parts of the world. For instance, the remarks by the Serbian president, who apologized for his country's vote on a resolution that many saw as compromising, signal the differences smaller nations now face in balancing historical ties with Russia against the pragmatic demands of European integration. In such an environment, Ukraine's challenge is not merely to secure economic or military aid, but to redefine its place within a shifting international order that is increasingly dominated by transactional logic rather than enduring alliances based on ethical and legal and historic principles. So what then is the path forward for Ukraine? President Zelensky's concessions, most notably his willingness to sign away the minerals deal, despite his initial misgivings and despite its inherent shortcomings, reflects a calculated risk, a situation where immediate economic relief, the prospect of re-engaging with powerful allies in Washington, seems tantalizing, and Ukraine appears to have opted for a pragmatic, if perilous, solution. This approach is fraught with long-term risks. Without explicit security guarantees, the minerals deal is simply a temporary bandage on a deep strategic wound. It's a plaster. It leaves Ukraine's sovereignty and economic assets vulnerable to future political shifts or even coercion. And in essence, Ukraine's current position is a classic case of being caught between a rock and a hard place. The nation is navigating a dual threat. On the one hand, the persistent spectre of Russian military and political pressure, and on the other, an unpredictable US policy that seems increasingly willing to trade support for transaction, for what it can gain. And this creates a situation where, in which every concession, no matter how economically beneficial in the short term, has cascading implications for Ukraine's long-term security and independence. Ukraine stands at a crossroads, defined by both opportunity and risk. And the UN's shifting dynamics and the controversial minerals deal reflect a broader transformation in international politics, where long-standing alliances are increasingly subject to the vicissitudes of economic interest and individual national agenda. And President Zelensky's strategy, while pragmatic in seeking to secure immediate benefits and reinforce ties with the United States, simultaneously exposes Ukraine to significant vulnerability that could be exploited by both Russia and by a future US government inclined towards some sort of gain rather than a committed support. And as Ukraine continues its struggle for sovereignty and stability in this changing, in this sort of earthquake, this tectonic plate movement, this political tectonic plate movement, the lessons are clear. Strategic concessions, however necessary in the short term, must be carefully balanced against the long-term imperative of national security. Kyiv must remain vigilant, must ensure that today's compromises do not become tomorrow's liabilities.